Globalization has lifted up more than 1 billion people out of poverty. What we need to do is not walk away from it, but reimagine it to pull those who were left out from the margins into the mainstream of global trade.
Hello and welcome to GZERO World. I'm Ian Bremmer, and today we are talking all about trade, the complex business of moving goods and services around the world. In the last half century, globalization has dramatically increased economic output. It's created hundreds of millions of jobs. It's lifted millions out of poverty. But development between countries has been uneven. Global inequality is on the rise. COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine exposed weaknesses in the global supply chain, and rising tension between the United States and China have led to a world economy that's becoming more and more fractured. All that uncertainty creates protectionism and nearshoring. But is the way out of a crisis not less trade, but more? And how do we make sure trade in the future is fair to countries, especially in the global south, who are reeling from runaway debt and bearing the brunt of climate change? My guest today, World Trade Organization Director-General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. But first, what do you do with 350 million gallons of radioactive water and nowhere to put it? It's a problem the government of Japan had to deal with when it ran out of space to store treated wastewater at the decommissioned Fukushima nuclear plant, and they began releasing it into the Pacific Ocean in August.
The decision to discharge water used to cool damaged reactors was approved by the United Nations nuclear watchdog last month.
It's a release that follows months of debate and strong opposition from fishing interests who say this is very bad for business.
China immediately banned imports of all Japanese seafood, and Japan's fishing industry took such a big hit that Prime Minister Kishida ate Fukushima sashimi in front of reporters to prove he wouldn't die. But besides eating octopus on camera, what do you do when one of the world's most powerful countries decides to ban your whole industry? Where do you go when someone isn't playing by the rules of the global economy? Well, that's where the World Trade Organization comes in. It's the referee of global trade, a forum to negotiate agreements and resolve disputes. And so one country bans your fish, or your fabric, or your farm equipment, or your octopus. The other can file a complaint for a WTO panel to decide whether the ban violates the rules. WTO was formed in 1995. It's barely a millennial, but it's based on the 1948 General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. It now has 164 member countries representing 98% of world trade. Major decisions are reached by consensus, and WTO's resolutions are binding. WTO policies have reduced tariffs. They've opened up new markets, but critics argue that it has been too slow to adapt to the modern economy, and it's made inequality worse by favoring wealthy countries, something the United States loudly disagrees with.
The World Trade Organization's been very unfair to the United States for many, many years.
Washington says the WTO's strict rules hurt U.S. jobs and industry while letting China shield its massive domestic market from foreign competition. For the past 7 years, the U.S. has been blocking appointments of new judges to the WTO appeals body. It's kind of like the Supreme Court of Trade. And without judges, WTO can't issue judgments, can't resolve disputes. Global trade surged to a record $32 trillion in 2022. With all the talk of protectionism and economic fracturing, China and U.S. trade are still inextricably linked. We need each other. And someone needs to set the rules. Someone needs to make sure countries follow them. World leaders, including the United States, have committed to reforming the WTO's broken dispute settlement system by 2024. But can they? Can they put aside their differences and come up with a system that works for everyone? Until that happens, you might not be eating any Japanese octopus in Beijing. My guest today is WTO Director-General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. She is the first woman and the first African, and by extension, the first African woman, see what I did there, to lead the organization. Since coming into office in 2021, she's pushed countries to recommit to globalization and to invest in developing economies. Here's our conversation. Madam Director General, so good to see you.
Thank you, Ian.
I want to start, we're here on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly, and you have been talking about the need for re-globalization. And I'm wondering if you could explain to our audience, what do you mean by that?
Well, thank you so much. We are in an era of geopolitical tensions, and many people are very pessimistic about the impact of globalization. Globalization has lifted up more than 1 billion people out of poverty. But it's true that some have been left behind. Poor people in rich countries and poor countries have been left behind. With that in mind, and with the tensions we've seen with the war in Ukraine, the pandemic and all that, an emerging pessimism about whether globalization can deliver has kind of taken hold. And we're saying that please let's remember what this globalization has delivered. What we need to do is not walk away from it, but reimagine it. And reimagine how it can help to pull those who were left out from the margins into the mainstream of global trade. That's what we're calling re-globalization. We're seeing opportunities where people see difficulties. Let me just be clear. We've seen the vulnerabilities of supply chains during the pandemic, and that has made people believe that we should reshore. You know, let's produce as much as we can at home.
At home.
Let's produce with our neighbors, our friends, because, you know, that's the only way we can be sure. And I understand those sentiments. And we are seeing some of that reshoring and nearshoring. But then there's also the desire to build global resilience, not to rely too much on any one group of countries or any country to produce things. So I'm seeing people saying we want interdependence, not overdependence. We want to build global resilience. Well, re-globalization is a tool for building global resilience.
So when you hear both the Americans, President Biden and others, and the Europeans, Ursula von der Leyen and others, talk about de-risking, and they're primarily talking about the relationship with China, but it does reflect and factor into this idea of global resilience as opposed to national resilience or resilience with your friends. How do you relate to that concept right now, the concept of de-risking?
Absolutely. I actually think that de-risking language began to come up after we started talking of this issue of building resilience through re-globalization, of not throwing away the benefits. To me, de-risking, when I listen to President von der Leyen talk about it, is very similar to what we're saying. Let us build supply chains, decentralized supply chains to countries where the environment is good, but who have not been in the mainstreams of globalization, and many of those exist. You know, people usually talk of China +1, and the +1 will be Vietnam or Indonesia or India. But we've got other countries that have the right environment. What about Bangladesh? What about Brazil? Mexico is already in. You know, what about in Africa? We've got Kenya. We've got Rwanda. We've got Senegal. And I could go on. I don't want to say my own country, Nigeria, which is the largest population.
You just said it. Come on.
And you know, in East Asia.
And the largest economy in Africa.
And the largest economy. In East Asia, we've got Cambodia, which is receiving some of that investment, and Laos. So I could go on and on. What we're saying is let's look at other countries where the investment environment is ripe. Let's decentralize supply chains. It's not right that 10 countries export 80% of the vaccines in the world. It's too concentrated. Semiconductors, we know that that's also very concentrated. Rare earths and minerals. So let's look, rare earths and minerals, there are many countries in Africa and Latin America that have these. Let's decentralize and try to bring those countries' supply chains into the mainstream.
And global labor has also been very concentrated, right? I mean, for the period of globalization, China was a very big piece of let's have the factory for the world. It's incredible amounts of inexpensive, very efficient labor. And you're right, some people in developed countries were displaced, but also there's a lot of concentration risk. And I do think that some of this conversation is about, wait a second, we don't need as much labor as we used to. That labor is a lot more expensive than it used to be. Shouldn't we be building things closer to where the consumer markets are, irrespective of whether that's at home or not?
Well, absolutely, Ian. You see, business, labor costs in China were already going up before the pandemic. And that is why you saw a lot of businesses also moving to Vietnam to produce things, to take advantage of the cheaper labor there, the higher productivity. So even before all this disappointment and the disruption we saw in supply chains, businesses were already making wise decisions based on the economics of what they could see. And so we should allow businesses to make the wise decisions, because I think they'll do the right thing mostly. Now, I think we may have to trade some efficiency to build resilience, meaning that we may need to diversify and decentralize production to many more countries.
So just in time was a little bit too efficient, if you will.
Well, it played its role and the world benefited from it. But now the time has come. Let me say one reason why I think we really need to pay attention to what we're saying. Climate change. Climate change is wreaking havoc in so many places. If you concentrate your production in any one place, you risk really disrupting things. There are examples when there were floods in Thailand at one time, and then the automobile industry was impacted by that. You see what is happening all over the world. So we do need to diversify if we want to build resilience. Diversify, decentralized production. But you're killing two birds with one stone.
So who are the champions? I mean, of course, the WTO. But when you look at leaders around the world, who do you see as champions for reglobalization today?
Well, I can tell you that Chancellor Olaf Scholz has been talking about how do we decentralize the fertilizer supply chain. Just as an example, he's been talking about this
really
notion.
Urgent given the Russian war in Ukraine.
Exactly.
Of course.
That again showed up vulnerabilities of dependence on the Black Sea region for grain, feed, and fertilizer. And so that talk about how do we decentralize fertilizer production so that the world is not so dependent on any one region. That's what we're also talking about. There you also create jobs in countries that were not part of the global, let's say, fertilizer or vaccine or pharmaceutical supply chain. So why don't we think of that? Why is it that why must it import more than 90% of its medicines and 99% of its vaccines? 1.4 billion people. Why don't you decentralize production there? You create jobs for young people, for women, and at the same time, you bring the countries there into the mainstream of trade and better integrate them. So we can kill two birds with one stone. So Chancellor Scholz is there, President Macron is talking about it. And also the de-risking notion that President von der Leyen is talking about is very related to this reglobalization.
When you're talking to me about imports of medicines, you're talking about vaccines, Africa hasn't yet globalized. What needs to happen with the Africa Union being a part of the agenda for the G20 now they brought in? What can we see in the next year or 2, 3 that would help meaningfully Africa to get on the path of globalization?
Well, Africa, you're absolutely right, has about 3% of world trade, and that's too small. But Africa is doing some things that are pretty exciting. The African Continental Free Trade Area is an area of the 55 countries and 1.4 billion people. Not if, that experiment really gets going, of Africans integrating better with themselves and trading and creating a real market of 1.4 billion, equal to that of China and India. That is automatically very attractive for trade for the world. We need to remove the barriers to trade, reduce the costs, because trade costs on the continent are quite high. When you do that, I think that will make the continent much more attractive for investment and bring it into that margin. The reglobalization can really begin to take place. We now need to convince businesses that Africa is not the big risk. There's a perception that it's a huge risk to invest on the continent, and perception is running ahead of reality.
So we've talked about the impact of geopolitics on reglobalization. The WTO, of course, is also caught up in some of this. Since I have you here, Ngozi, I have to ask you about the broken dispute resolution settlement mechanism. And the Americans have been holding up the appointment of appellate judges. Supposedly reform needs to happen of the WTO before they're willing to make that happen. Is that moving forward?
Yes, yes, it is. First, just to correct one thing, the system is really not broken. It's 2 tiers. So there's a panel level, and last year 17 cases were brought, and cases are being brought every day.
And they get resolved at the panel level.
Yeah. The panel gives a judgment. The problem we have is, quite rightly, like you said, Ian, the second tier, the appellate body, is not functioning because, as you said, the US blocked the election of judges into that tier. So what happens is, if there's a quote-unquote judgment against a member, they can appeal it into the void, since that second tier is not functioning. So it's very crucial that it functions, because if you negotiate agreements, it's not good that the mechanism for enforceability doesn't work well and smoothly. So we are reforming it. The US has been very constructive now, and they have laid out what their problems are with the system. We have a process ongoing at the WTO. We hope that by the time we have our 13th ministerial meeting in Abu Dhabi, yes, end of February 2024, that we would have gone a substantial way towards agreeing on this reform and the form it should take. So work is visibly underway, and I'm hopeful. I don't want to be too hopeful, but I'm hopeful that we will go a long distance in this reform.
Does that mean that next year, more likely than not, we actually will have a breakthrough of this impasse on the appellate court?
I'm hoping so. Actually, at our 12th ministerial June last year, members signed on the dotted line to reform of this well-functioning dispute settlement system by 2024. I think the issue now is when in 2024, and we're trying to say, let's get it done by February, when we have this ministerial meeting.
Well, we're very litigious in the United States, so we want to be able to bring people to court. Let's get this resolved.
Let me tell you that the US is one of the biggest users of the system, and they've won the most cases. They've also lost, but they've won more than they've lost. So we hope that some of the complaints they're making are legitimate. They are not the only ones who have problems with the system. Developing countries also find it difficult to access. So let's take all these complaints. Let's try and reform the system and make it useful to everyone.
Madam Director General, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Ian.
That's our show this week. Come back next week if you like what you see, or you just want to trade. You want to trade more. You got some NFTs. You got some crypto. You know where to go. Not GZERO. No. But if you care about the world, why don't you check out our excellent morning newsletter? It's called GZERO Daily.